little difficult for this committee because we don't have a regular committee slot. And there are so many committees this year that there's no rooms. There's not a slot anywhere unless we go into an evening or try to pick a Friday. But that's normal for this committee. But I thought maybe we should get started. I know we've got some people new to the committee, but let's kind of introduce everybody, and then when we get done with the members, we'll go to staff. So give me a little idea, kind of where you grew up and maybe what your occupation is, or if you're like me, you're retired, or what you're doing, something about your family maybe. I think it's helpful for us all to get to know something about each other. So I guess I'll start. I'm Tom Bach, born on the Iron Range, have lived here my whole life, but for a couple of years off at college in Duluth. My wife Laura and I live on Lake Vermilion. Got 4 kids, 8 grandkids now. I've been a member of the legislature for a while. That's Dick Cohen's line. I've been doing this a while. 8 years in the House and came over to the Senate in 2000 and the 2002 election. So happy to be with you all. We're gonna do this remotely as long as we have to, I guess. And hopefully we can get around to doing it in person, but certainly we're gonna be doing it in person when we start doing some touring, probably late summer, to start looking at projects. So with that, did we get Sen John on? Maybe we can go with Dave. Dave, a little introduction.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Bach. Dave Sen John, a state senator now for 19 years. Have been around the bonding committee, I guess every one of those 19 years, served as chair a couple of times along the way. It's a great committee. It does great things. I believe in it wholeheartedly in terms of how important infrastructure is to the state of Minnesota. Grew up in a little town of Hayfield, Minnesota, a good long time ago. Like most good Lutherans, or a lot of them at least, went off to Luther College and graduated, and went off then to Mayo Clinic and worked 44 years. Served on our city council in Rochester for 11. Came then to the Minnesota Senate and have thoroughly enjoyed this and thoroughly enjoyed this committee, and look forward to our work this year, next couple of years.
David, officially, I guess you and I are both retired. We're just full-time lawmakers, huh?
I go to work every day, Tom.
Senator Pappas is the ranking Democrat on the committee. She's been on it a long time. She's a former chair of it too. Sandy?
Thank you so much, Tom. I also was born on the range, born in Hibbing, but I grew up in Minneapolis suburbs, but I've been in the city of St. Paul since the 1970s. As long as we're talking about families, I have a lot of fame to claim. I have 3 daughters, went to Central High School in St. Paul, but I have 28, soon to be 29 grandchildren, one due any minute now. And my oldest granddaughter is also pregnant. So in May, I'll be a great grandmother. And that's pretty amazing for somebody who's only 49, right? I served, like Tom, I served 6 years in the House. I came over to the Senate in 1991. I was chair of the Higher Ed Committee. And as such, I was on the bonding committee and also on the conference committees when we had them. For many years. So I've been on many tours, kind of stopped going because I had to have hip replacement surgeries, but looking forward to getting back in the saddle. And that's me. Thanks.
Bobby Joe Champion, welcome to the committee.
Thank you there, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you having me on this committee, and I'm excited always to be on the Capital Investments Committee, better known as bonding. Just so you know, I represent Senate District 59, which is comprised of all of North Minneapolis, the North Loop, downtown, Bryn Mawr, and Elliott Park. So if you are going to any of our ballparks or theaters, you are in my Senate District in Minneapolis, and I want to encourage you to continue to go downtown and spend lots of money. So that's always important. I've served on the bonding committee before, or the Capital Investments Committee before, and I've always enjoyed it, the opportunity when I could get out to see what's what's going on in our great state and the needs, and seeing what we can do as a committee in order to meet those needs. Unlike the chair and the ranking DFL member, I was not born on the range. I was born in North Minneapolis. My parents migrated from the South, so I am the second to the youngest. So they migrated from Hooks, Texas, and my dad is from Hope, Arkansas, and they migrated from the South to the North. And I was born in Minneapolis. I went to North High School. I'm proud to say that. Not to mention this weekend is the Super Bowl, and Tyler Johnson, who graduated from North High School and went to play for the Gophers, is playing in the Super Bowl. So we're pretty excited about that, as well as Anton Whitfield, who is from Minnesota as well. I went to McAllister College and then William Mitchell for law school. So I have two kids, Jalen and Miles, that are home, but Jalen, who is in his second year at Colorado State University, and I often joke with Julie Rosen about this. She graduated from Colorado State, and my son is also attending there. And I have a senior in high school who is deciding between 7 colleges which one he's going to go to. I tell him that we want to go to the one that gives us the most money. So it doesn't matter. Whoever gives us the most money, that's where he's going. So again, I'm excited to be here, and thank you for having me on the committee.
Thanks, Bobby Joe. Senator Dames.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was born and raised in Clements, Minnesota, south of Redwood Falls, and left for a short stint and went into Minneapolis, St. Paul area, and graduated the University of Minnesota. And then in '74, moved back to Redwood Falls and established a business there. I retired from the insurance business about 8 years ago. Came into the legislature, came into the Senate, and I was elected in 2010. And prior to that, I was a county commissioner in Redwood County, and appreciate the opportunity to serve on the bonding committee. I think it's a committee that's very well needed and does a lot of good things. In rural Minnesota, we really appreciate bonding because we have a lot of projects that's about the only way we're going to get them done is through assistance with the state. So do appreciate it. Look forward to bonding this year.
So Gary, weren't you a former county commissioner too?
Yes. When I came into the Senate, I came from Redwood County as a commissioner.
Okay. Senator Dorrnick.
Good morning, all, Mr. Chair. So I grew up down by Preston, Minnesota, which on a dairy farm. And then from there, I went to vocational school at Austin, and I got into carpentry and residential first, and then ended up getting married and started having some kids. So I needed something a little bit more secure. So I joined the Carpenters Union in Rochester and worked there for 22 years. Got laid off in '09. And at that time, we had 12 children. So unemployment wasn't going to be enough for me to survive. So we started a family business and have been a small construction company for the last 11 years. So I guess I'll go back to, I've been married for 35 years, 12 children, 8 girls, 4 boys, 13 grandchildren. Very blessed with family, and appreciate that. And let's see, so I'm serving for the first time. So I'm the new guy, not only in the Senate, but in this committee. So I look forward to that. I enjoy building, so this will be fun to see how you guys work it. And I serve in District 27. Austin, Elberly, and Wells are the big community or towns. I think that's about it. So thank you, and look forward to the opportunity to serve with you all.
Well, welcome to the Senate, Jane.
Thank you.
Senator Jasinski.
Thanks, Tom. Senator John Jasinski, District 24. That's Faribault, Ottawa-Waseca, just south of Minneapolis on I-35. Been involved in government for 28 years. Started as a planning commission member, city council member, mayor for 8 years here in Faribault. Also been involved in real estate for 30 years, from a real estate appraiser to property manager to real estate sales to brokerage to development. Pretty much everything in real estate I've done. In my second term in the Senate, I've been on bonding for now 5 years, which was actually one of my favorite committees. And I think Senji and Susie can tell you, I think I missed 3 site visits in my 5 years on the bonding committee. Is one of my favorites. And one of those I had to take off to my son's emergency appendectomy up at UMD. So I had to leave and go up there while he was there. And I actually made it there by the time he came out of surgery. So it was good. 2 kids, both at UMD up in Box Country. I was in the UMD as well, and then I went 4 years in the military where I was an air intercept controller, controlled F-14s for most of my time in the military, and then finished school at Mankato State, and have been in my community ever since. So enjoy the committee. It's obviously my favorite. I think it's a great committee for us to interact with each other, and I really enjoy seeing and working across the aisle with all you faces out there, both R's, D's, and I's. So thanks.
So did anybody notice, John's only been around, this is his 5th session, but he's a pretty darn savvy member. Anybody notice his shirt? That's the Minnesota Iron Mining Association. So
I wore that for you, Tom. I wanted to see if you're going to notice that or not.
Oh, yeah. Rangers never forget when they have friends.
Yeah, I just want to say I spent a ton of time up on Lake Vermilion. It's probably my second most favorite place in the world. I have about 6 or 7 friends up there, including Tom, and I spend a lot of time up there both in the summer and the winter. It's beautiful up there. So thanks again, Tom.
Well, my office looks out at the lake, and it's looking pretty cold and frozen out there right now, and pretty windy, snow blowing around. Senator Stuart Johnson, welcome to the Senate.
Thank you. I too am a newbie, and it's good to be here. I'm thrilled to be on bonding. I'm a civil engineer, and I have spent my career building things mostly around the public infrastructure way. So I don't know much about carpentry, but I know a lot about how a sewer system works. I own a small company. We do construction inspection and materials testing on federally and state funded jobs. So I actually got my concrete testing clothes on today because I was testing concrete this morning. I love construction. I love being on job sites. I managed the construction management program at the university for 15 years, which was a program that was initially started in what we used to call extension. And really, it was actually funded by the legislature to provide continuing education opportunities for construction trades and construction workers. We also created a facilities management program that I managed for a while. And so I know quite a bit about what we call vertical construction or building, but mostly commercial. I am not a big residential construction person, but obviously we have expertise in other areas on that. I'm from Wisconsin. I think I'm the only one so far. I grew up in northern Wisconsin and Wausau. I went to small farm college, University of Wisconsin at Platteville. Came here to do my master's research in pavement engineering. So I could bore you for hours on aggregates and freeze thaw resistance. And then I started my own company. So I've taught at the U for about 25 years. I've taught at Dunwoody and St. Paul Tech as well. I'm a natural teacher, so you'll have to tell me to shut up when we get out on some of these job sites because I love to explain what's going on. I have 4 kids, 2 plus 2. I'm a trophy wife, so my husband had 2 kids when we got married. I like to say that because Sandy, I'm even younger than you and I have 3 grandchildren. So, but I'm a trophy grandma too. So my 2 girls are at Duluth. So I think Senator Jasinski said he's got one at Duluth. I have one at Duluth in her senior year, and I have one at River Falls in her senior year of her grad school. So, and my husband's a civil engineer too. So he's going to be jealous when I get to go touring with you guys.
So Senator Murphy's from Wisconsin also, and I always tease her that if I grew up in Wisconsin, I'd live in Minnesota today too.
I know she's from Wisconsin. We have much in common. But anyway, we try to keep our group small. It's hard to get in.
Your daughter's up in Duluth at what school?
She's at UMD. She's studying technical theater. She begged me not to make her be a civil engineer, so we relented.
Remind me to give you a bulldog pin. I've got a bunch of them in my desk so that you can surprise her with it.
Okay.
So 3 bulldogs on the committee, John. That's pretty good. Senator Pratt.
Well, good morning. Eric Pratt. I represent Senate District 55, which is Scott County, Prior Lake, Shakopee, Jordan. Most people know it as Valley Fair, Canterbury Park, Mystic Lake, and the Renaissance. We have some great tourism down here. I grew up in Prior Lake and moved home, have 2 kids, one at the University of Michigan studying astrophysics, and the other one in Dallas at the University of Texas studying physical therapy. So thank God they take after their mother. I graduated from University of Colorado with a degree in economics, and then I got my business degree from University of St. Thomas. I spent 30 years in financial services, banking, and credit card lending, fraud detection and prevention with the old First Bank system, US Bank, and Target Corporation. It's my first time on the committee, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Eric. Senator Uyghur.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Chuck Uyghur. My district is number 43, North St. Paul, Maplewood, Oakdale, White Bear Lake, Matamidi, Birchwood, Willerny. And I love this committee. I'm so happy I got on, and I wasn't sure if there'd be a bonding bill. As soon as I heard that you're going to be the chair, yes, there's going to be a bonding bill. So I am a lifelong resident of the North St. Paul Maplewood area, graduated from North High, and then went to Hamline University, University of Minnesota during summer sessions, and got my law degree. In addition, I went to the University of Colorado Boulder, as did Senator Pratt, where you did not mention you were a football star. And I believe Senator Rosen went there too. So I worked at Security and Financial for over 2 centuries, parts of last in this, as an attorney, a compliance specialist, and get more into all that at another point. Have 5 adult children, 5 grandchildren in elementary, middle, and high school. And that would be a little bit about my background. And again, I'm so happy to be on this committee to focus on the needs of the state. And in addition to learning that, just learning to get to know each other. And it's clearly the most bipartisan group in the process. And I so much enjoy it. Thank you.
Chuck, you forgot the most important thing. Senator Uyghur has a cabin up in my district that he spends quite a bit of time at up on the North Shore. So he's got a connection to the North also.
I do.
Who should we start with? Let's start with Stephanie James. We want to hear from our staff also, so everybody can get to know them. Stephanie?
Mr. Chair, members, Stephanie James, I staffed this committee and I have since 2011. I'm originally from Bismarck, North Dakota. So yeah, you can also make your joke about North Dakota and coming to Minnesota from there. My undergraduate degree is in mechanical engineering, but I didn't work as a mechanical engineer. I went straight to law school. This is a second career for me. I was a patent lawyer for 20 years before I came to the Senate in 2011. So, and I'm a crazy dog person. We don't have any kids, so I'm overly invested in my dogs.
Thanks, Steph. Casey, Mom, our fiscal analyst for the committee.
Hi, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm Casey Mom. I'm the fiscal analyst for the committee. Don't hold it against me, but I was born and raised in Iowa. I stayed there through college, and after school, I worked in economic development for a little bit and before coming here. This will be my 7th session with the Senate. I've staffed the Capital Investment Committee that whole time, and my wife and I have 2 kids under 5. The youngest is just about to turn a year old, so I'm looking forward to getting some good sleep again someday.
Susi Groux, our committee administrator. She is not new to the committee. Those of you that have been on the committee know that. Susi?
Hi, I'm Susi Groux. I am happy to say that I am from Wisconsin as well, Senator Johnson. Grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. However, Senator Bach, as my 3 sisters and myself are all relocated and now called the Twin Cities our home. So not just myself, but my 3 sisters as well. I am overly invested in all of my 11 nieces and nephews, and I am by far the best aunt, the cool aunt. This will be my 4th session in the Senate, and I'm happy to serve all of you. While I'm from Wisconsin, from planning 2 statewide tours and staring at maps and looking at cities and how do we get from A to B to C, I have been from Thief River Falls to Wyndham to Worthington to Ely and everywhere in between. And I would challenge any of you to a Minnesota geography test. So I look forward to the planning tours again with all of you, working with all of you this summer and into our bonding year, as well as anything I could do for you this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Larissa Shea. Larissa's my LA. She's been with me since, correct me, Larissa, 2015, I think?
Yes, yep, that's correct. I'm Larissa. This is my 7th session with Senator Bach. And I'm happy to help out. Oh, I'm from West Central Minnesota. So I was born up in the Alexandria area in a small town called Brandon. I think its population is under 500. I graduated with 15 kids in my high school graduating class. I went up to Moorhead. I graduated from Concordia College in Moorhead. So I'm a copper.
Very good. Well, let's, I don't want to tie up too much of everybody.
Senator Bach, I just want to make sure we get Craig and Andy as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Craig?
Hi, Senator Bach, Chair Bach. Craig Janisich. I grew up on the Iron Range in Chisholm. So another ranger. I went to school at Mankato State. Went out to DC for a little bit, came back, worked at the city of Minneapolis, and have been with the Minnesota Senate now for over 10 years. Look forward to getting to know all of you. It's a great committee, so thanks.
So Craig is partisan research for the Democrats, and Andy, introduce yourself.
Yep, thank you, Senator. My name is Andy Larson. I grew up in the Twin Cities suburbs, went to the University of Minnesota, so I've been a lifelong Minnesotan. This is my, I think, 7th now year at the session of the Senate, 5th as a researcher, but first on capital investment.
Great, thank you. Susie, I think we got everybody. Okay, let's, so we don't tie up too much time, I guess. Maybe, I don't know who wants to start first, Stephanie or Casey. We'll just do an overview of the little bit of the history of the committee and what bonding's really about. And you'll hear me refer to as bonding. The official name of the committee's capital investment, but those of you that are new, oftentimes it gets referred to as bonding, which is the same thing. Stephanie or Casey?
Yes, I think I'll go first, Mr. Chair. So I need to share my screen, and that, oh, here's the little icon. All right. And then, oops. There we go. Can everybody see that? Is that working for everyone? You should see a title page there. Okay, good. Thank you. So I'm going to start with the very most basic thing. What is a bond? A bond is just, bonding is just a way for the state to borrow money. So we issue bonds, collect the proceeds from those bonds, and then appropriate them, and promise to the bondholders that we will pay them back with interest over time. General obligation bonds are the primary instrument that this committee uses to appropriate money for projects. General obligation bonds are special, different than other kinds of debt instruments, because they are backed by the full faith and credit of the state. And what that means is that we promise the bondholders that if necessary to make bond payments, we will levy property taxes to pay. So that makes them a very safe bet, very reliable. And that in turn means a low interest rate for us. We can only use general obligation bonds on certain kinds of projects. They have to have a public purpose, and that's actually a requirement for all expenditures of state money. That's a fairly low bar, easy enough to reach. Projects have to be specified in law, and that is the reason why we agonize over every word in the riders for capital investment projects, especially for the local projects. The Constitution requires that specificity. And it's why those appropriations are different than appropriations that you'll see in other kinds of bills. Also, we can only use general obligation bonds for certain kinds of projects, and the Constitution lists the kinds of projects that we can take on this kind of debt for. The bond, and we'll cover that in the next slide. Bonds have to mature within 20 years. And then bills that authorize GO bonds have to originate in the House. And this stems from the backing of the full faith and credit. There's an implication that we'll raise taxes if need be. And so any bills that raise revenue have to originate in the House. And that is why bonding bills need to originate in the House. This is the list of purposes in the Constitution for what we can use general obligation bonds to pay for. And the first one is the category that is most familiar to everyone. Most of the projects funded in a bonding bill fall within this first category: to acquire and to better public land and buildings and other public improvements of a capital nature. The remainder of the categories are less used, but once in a while we come across them. I'll just note that for things that fall within categories 2 through 9, they don't require a 3/5 vote the way projects funded in category 1 have to have a 3/5 vote. And also the projects in categories 2 through 9 don't necessarily have to be capital, and they don't have to necessarily be publicly owned. So for example, number 8 provides for railroad projects that can be public or private. So, but by far and away, the top category is the one that we make use of the most. So that first category requires that projects be capital. And what does that mean? That means that the project has to be a fixed asset. So we can't use GO bonds for, say, cars or vehicles or something like that. It has to be long-lived. It has to have a lifespan of at least 10 years. It has to be a substantial improvement and can't be merely repairs or maintenance. So for example, just replacing worn out carpet is not a capital project. Next, it has to be publicly owned. And this is a topic that frequently comes up. It's clear enough when a project is owned by the state. When we get into some of the local government projects, some of them are sometimes a combination of public-private partnerships, or they might be a nonprofit who's looking for bonding proceeds, and we can't ever give bonding proceeds to a project that's owned by those private entities. It has to be publicly owned. Sometimes what happens is that a city or county will own the property and then lease it to a nonprofit. And sometimes then there can be a misunderstanding about whether or not we bonded for something that's privately owned, but we can't, not with GO bonds. And then, as we mentioned before, this top category of acquiring and bettering public buildings requires a 3/5 vote. We have no constitutional or statutory limit on the amount of public debt that the state can take on, but we do have an MMB policy that's been implemented for quite some time. The standard changed, but right now we have 3 debt capacity guidelines. The first one is that the total tax supported principal that is outstanding at a point in time has to be 3.25% or less of the total state personal income. And that total state personal income is a statistical measure. The second guideline is the total amount of principal, both issued and authorized but unissued, for state GO bonds, also state moral obligations, which includes appropriation bonds, equipment capital leases, and real estate capital leases can't exceed 6% of state personal income. So that second category captures both issued and expenditures that are authorized but not yet issued. And then it captures a bunch of other types of public debt. And then category 1 does. And we have to meet each of these guidelines at all times. The third guideline has to do with the timing of issuances, and that's something that generally isn't of concern to this committee. It's something that's managed by MMB for the most part. And Casey will provide you with the numbers of what those thresholds are for categories 1 and 2, which I know is of great interest at all times to members. And the reason that we have, or one of the effects of having these guidelines to constrain public debt is to guard our creditworthiness of the state. Currently, we enjoy the highest rating from the credit rating agencies with all three credit ratings agencies for the bonds that were sold in August of 2020. With each bond issue, we get a rating from a credit rating agency. And so these are the highest ratings in our most current GO bond issuance. Now, the lion's share of the general obligation bonds that we sell are enjoy the privilege of tax-exempt status under federal law. And that status carries with it a bunch of constraints, again, on how the proceeds are used, so what the projects can pay for. One of the requirements for tax-exempt status is a limit on the amount of private use in the project. And so this can come up in a lot of contexts when you build a public building and then allow private vendors to have shops or that kind of thing. So for example, in college projects where there's little shops that are leased out to people to make money at, those kinds of things affect private use. And this is something that we kind of keep an eye on. We'll maybe discourage the use of GO bonds as a debt financing mechanism for projects that have a lot of private use. And then now there's other financing options that we can and do use to pay for projects if they don't fit within the constraints that we have on GO bond financing. One of those is appropriation bonds. Another is revenue bonds, another is certificates of participation, and another is lease purchase financing. I just sent out yesterday a link to a document that we have that describes the history and the uses of appropriation bonds since 2011. And the other ones are less commonly used, but they're also something that comes up sometimes. I think I won't go into a lot of detail on the other types of financing, but just a couple of points about appropriation bonds. They were new in 2011 and held valid as a debt mechanism by the Minnesota Supreme Court in 2012. And by that, I mean that the Supreme Court held that appropriation bonds are not public debt within the definition in the Constitution, and therefore they don't need a 3/5 vote to pass. They can be used on privately owned property. Those are sort of the big things, and they wouldn't necessarily the bill wouldn't have to originate in the House. And appropriation bonds are not backed by the full faith and credit of the state. The sale to the bondholders specifically very clearly says the state isn't promising to raise taxes to pay you back. If there's an amount appropriated to make payments on the bonds, that payment will be applied. So it's a pretty soft promise, but at the same time, it's a relatively good bet that states are not going to back out of paying off their debts. So it's a moral obligation and also gets good interest rates, but the interest rate will be slightly higher than you get for GO bonds. Trunk highway bonds is another type of debt instrument that shows up in the bonding bill. There's a special constitutional provision for authorizing trunk highway bonds. The proceeds of trunk highway bonds can only be spent for trunk highway purposes. And there are a lot of projects that involve a trunk highway, but may also involve other aspects of the community, the crossroads or rerouting of trails or a host of other components to a trunk highway project. And so for those kinds of projects, we have to have help from the Department of Transportation and MMB to figure out how much should be trunk highway, how much is a trunk highway purpose, and how much should be applied to the other aspects of the project that we could pay for with GO bonds. There are also agency issued appropriation bonds. These are the most common variety of these that you hear about are the MHFA housing infrastructure bonds. And the link that I sent yesterday also includes a document that will give you more information about housing infrastructure bonds. Those are sort of perennially funded in the bonding bill, although they wouldn't necessarily have to be. And revenue bonds are backed by a designated revenue stream. They say we will make payments from whatever this revenue stream is. If there's no revenue, then we don't pay those, then we can't pay. Those also have a higher interest rate than GO bonds. The tobacco settlement revenue bonds are an example from 2011. And now we'll go through a few slides that are of describe topics of interest to local governments who might be interested in securing funding in the bonding bill. And we rely on members to be a conduit of this kind of information to your local governments, to your cities and your counties. Although we're always here to help with that too. There are two separate processes that local governments can go through to seek capital funding. One is an MMB process where they submit all of the information through the MMB system to be considered for the governor's capital budget proposal. The other is a legislative process where they have one of you author a bill for them that describes their project and pays for it with bond proceeds. The process that we go through over the course of a cycle for this is that in June of an odd year, so June of this year, agencies and local governments will be invited by MMB to submit their project requests. And by about July, maybe sometimes August, MMB reports all of those requests to the legislature. Those are the giant books of projects. Generally, the agency projects are grouped into one, and then the local government projects are in another. It's available online, but they do also send over copies, and that information is invaluable to those of us who are trying to write individual bonding bills, and will be useful when we put together an omnibus bill too. And then in January, and then in this fall, I should have mentioned this, in the fall of the odd numbered year, historically, the bonding committee has gone on tours of projects requested. And then in January of the even year, so this almost a year from now, the governor will submit a capital budget proposal to the legislature. Historically, the legislature has passed larger bonding bills in that even year and smaller bonding bills in the odd year. In the budget year, not as much has been done typically with bonding. And then in the fall, after the legislature passes a bonding bill, a larger one in the even year, then MMB will sell bonds on an as-needed basis, typically in the fall. And there's several steps to that process, to the selling of the bonds. First, bond counsel reviews all of the proposal, all of the items that are funded in the bonding bill, and renders an opinion about the tax exempt status. Do we meet the federal requirements for tax exempt status? And also constitutionality. Do these purposes meet the constitutional requirements that we have in the state? And the opinion is part of the sale offering. And the sale offering is it's called an official statement, and the official statements are published on the MMB website. And then ratings agencies will issue a rating for that bond issue. And then MMB hosts an online auction to find an underwriter to win the opportunity to sell the state's bonds. And then recently, we've given them negotiated authority to select an underwriter and negotiate the terms of the bond offering too. So that's an option as well. There are two funding requirements for every project that is funded with GO bonds. The project has to be fully funded, and there's a statutory requirement for a non-state match. The full funding requirement is really of constitutional proportion, that to be a capital project, it has to be something that is a complete phase or project. And so we don't pay for portions of projects. And how do you define a project? It's whatever we've described in the rider. If we say we're paying for pre-design and design, then the amount that we've appropriated in combination with the amount that the local government has committed to the project from its funds or other funds that it may have, that has to totally pay for the project as described. The 50% non-state match is merely a statutory requirement, and that is something that on a on a fairly regular basis is modified or waived. And then one last topic for you is the cancellation report. Appropriations for capital projects, no matter what fund it comes from, have a 4-year window to be expended, which is different than most appropriations, which only have a 2-year time frame. So 4 years after, in January, MMB publishes a cancellation report that looks back to everything that was appropriated more than 4 years earlier. And anything that ends up on the cancellation report in January will be automatically canceled in July. So the cancellation report that's available now includes appropriations that would have been appropriated in the 2015 bonding bill and earlier. There was no bonding bill in 2016, but if there had been, then those appropriations would be, any unspent amount of those unencumbered amount of those appropriations would show up on the cancellation report. Bond proceeds come with some strings, and so it's important that the local governments appreciate that there are some sacrifices that come with taking bond proceeds. One has to do with how easily it will be for them for the city to, or county or local government to divest of the property. So projects where the idea is that the city or state would rehabilitate a piece of property and then sell it off to developers, that's not a great candidate for geo bonding, because that sale is a cumbersome thing with bond proceeds. MMB publishes a document called After the Bonding Bill, and it's very useful for local governments to be aware of that and to have read that even before they apply for bond proceeds, so that they understand what they're in for. And that is all I have prepared for you, and I'm happy to take questions, or maybe you want to wait till after Casey goes through his presentation.
I have a question, Mr. Chair.
Bobby Joe.
Ms. James, when you were talking about publicly owned property that has to be owned by either the state or a local municipality, and you indicated that it can't be owned by a private entity, but then you said that sometimes it's owned by a public entity and leased to a private entity. Are you saying that that would be an okay form of doing things in order to meet the publicly owned requirement for bonding purposes?
Mr. Chair and Senator Champion, yes, that is a common structure for finding a way to finance property that will be used by a private entity. But it has to be owned by the public entity, and then that use agreement is something that has to have particular terms. It has to be limited in time, and the government that is owning the facility has to be able to and takes on the responsibility of running whatever program that is, so that if the nonprofit is unable to continue, that local government will still be required to use that property for the purpose that's been defined for it.
So am I hearing you correctly when I hear you say nonprofit, but are they able to do the same sort of lease agreement with a private entity? Or are you, I want to make sure that I'm using the right terminology, because I heard you say nonprofit, but I wasn't sure if you were saying that's synonymous with private.
Mr. Chair and Senator Champion, yes, if you have just a private for-profit entity, then you're going to run into some issues with the tax exempt status of the bonds, private use, that kind of thing. So they're not quite synonymous. So it's good that you caught me on that. But it works better with the nonprofit organizations because you don't run up against the same sort of private use problems with the federal tax law.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Sen John, then Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Ms. James. Tagging a little off Senator Champion's question, and I kind of think better by example. Going back to the not-for-profit, the local government, whatever it might be, county, city, and so on, partnering with a local government on a bonding project. And let's just say, okay, we had a reading center in Rochester. It could be a Boys and Girls Club. It could be anything. If the proceeds for the bonds go to the city, the county, the local unit of government, they lease the building then to the occupant, be it a reading center or a Boys and Girls Club or whatever. And the local unit of government's obligated, if that function does no longer exist for whatever reasons it might be, the local unit of government, is this right, has to maintain that function for, is it the period of the bonds or how long? If, for instance, that reading center in Rochester closed down because of financial reasons or whatever it might be, does the reading center, does the Olmsted County, in our case, have to continue to operate that reading center function for a period of time?
Mr. Chair, Senator Sen John, yes, that's right. They have to continue to operate it for, I believe it's 125% of the life of the project.
Which was anticipated to be 20 years with it. Is the life of a project related to the length of the bonds?
Mr. Chair and Senator Sen John, no, not necessarily. Of course, to be funded with GO bonds, it has to have a useful life of at least 10 years. But the bonds can be up to 20 years. So
Sure.
there's not an exact correlation between those two things.
Could I, Ms. Senator Bach, so I don't know if the example I gave you was a good one or not, but how would you determine how long the function would have to continue to be, in this case, run by a local unit of government? Is there a formula?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, Senator Sen John, I'm not sure
Okay.
how MMB computes that or what's required for that. It would depend on what the project is, what the useful life would be. And you're right, there's maybe some sorts of standard life expectancies of like a building as opposed to a bridge or something like that. Yeah.
But that's, thank you, Ms. James and Mr. Bach. Senator Bach, that's a good enough answer for today.
Okay. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It just goes to show that even those of us who've been around for a while still have questions about how this whole process works. So last year, a bill that normally would have been passed in the spring 2020, and then typically MMB sells bonds in August, just correct any of what I'm saying when I ask my question. And so we didn't pass the bill until October. So I talked to the commissioner about how those projects were going to be funded then when they were going to do a bond sale. They did do one in August, but not based on the October 2020 bill. And he said, not until the following August. So I said, well, all these projects have to wait then a whole another year. And he said that they can advance fund projects. So I was confused about that because evidently then bond sales are not tied to a specific project. They're more broad or more general. So could you just clarify some of that for me? And
yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. This may be details that I don't have a lot of knowledge about, but I can offer some things. The bond sale, the amount of the bond sale doesn't match up exactly with the amount of bonds that are authorized in the spring. Instead, MMB identifies the amount that they think is going to be necessary for the coming year for everything that's been authorized before that. And so oftentimes there's only a small percentage of the things that are that show up in a bill in a given year that MMB thinks they're going to need money for right away. Which is not to say that they will release the appropriations right away if the project is ready to go. They're selling bonds on an as-needed basis, as cash is needed. And so they are evaluating what they think the needs are for the coming year and selling according to that. Yeah. So I think that's probably about as much as I can say, other than they have a way of managing the cash flow. And so I've never heard of an instance where a project said, we're ready to go, but MMB doesn't have any money for us. It's advanced in some manner. Yeah.
Senator Pappas, is that okay for now? Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Ms. James, I was just kind of wondering, could you, you said that bonding couldn't be used for repairs. And, you know, I think through, usually a big part of the bonding bill is Heber, which in my mind is repairs and upkeep. Can you tell me how we define repairs and how that kind of fits into the bonding bill as a first term member?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, that is an outstanding question that I have asked myself, and there is no answer as far as I know to why it is that we can fund Heber when it is largely maintenance kinds of things. I think there is a distinction between some sort of the more major maintenance things, renovations, that as opposed to merely repainting a room or merely recarpeting or something like that. And so I think Heber gets at sort of more the definition in statute of what's under the Heber program are things that are appropriately paid for with bond proceeds that meet the definition of capital.
Thank you.
Senator Stewart Johnson.
Yes, for those of us new, what does Heber mean?
Stephanie?
Mr. Chair, yeah, Mr. Chair and members, Heber is cheaper. First of all, you're going to want to remember that phrase. But Heber is the Higher Education Asset Preservation Program. So it's asset preservation for the colleges, for the U of M and for MnSCU, or Minnesota State. We also have an asset preservation program under DNR, and also one for under admin that pays for buildings that are under the control of admin.
Any other questions? If not, we'll thank you, Stephanie. We'll move on to Casey then.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm also going to share my screen and have a slideshow prepared. And I'm going to go a little deeper into some of the fiscal aspects of the committee, but it's still going to be a fairly high-level overview. It's kind of three parts to it. One is, what have we done in the past for bonding bills? The second is, how do we prepare for what we are going to do in the near future? And then the third is, how do we manage and pay for all of this after a bonding bill is enacted? So this is just a table showing the bond authorizations that have been enacted from 1983 to present, including the bonding bill that was passed in the 5th special session last year. Just a note here that this is purely the amount that was enacted at the time. This doesn't reflect any cancellations or other adjustments that have been made afterwards. And so it doesn't necessarily reflect what was actually spent. As Stephanie mentioned, generally an appropriation of a capital investment appropriation has 4 years to be spent. If it's not spent in that time, it cancels. And we have sometimes canceled part of the appropriation proactively if we, have information suggesting that it's not going to be fully spent. It's probably hard to tell looking at this in table form, but the pattern that Stephanie mentioned of larger bonding bills being enacted in even numbered years is borne out here. And that's, typically been because in the odd numbered years, we're putting together the state's operating budget. In the even numbered years, there's a little more attention that's being able to be given to the capital budget. This next slide just shows what that looks like graphically. You can see there's a general pattern of bonding bills getting a little bit larger every year. About 15 years ago, a couple things changed in the pattern. One is that trunk highway fund bonds became a larger component of capital investment bills. And also, you'll notice that the pattern became a little more erratic. It wasn't bonding bills weren't enacted in as consistent of a pattern as had been enacted in the past. So that's borne out here. The next component is, well, how do we plan for what bonding bills are going to be enacted in the future? And Minnesota Management and Budget does that through their forecasting process, their forecast that is released twice a year. So in order to estimate how much bonding the state will enact in the future, MMB looks to the past, and they assume that the legislature will pass a bonding bill that is equal to the 10-year average of the bonding bills that they have passed over the past decade. The amounts are different in odd-numbered and even-numbered years because of the pattern that I described. And based on that amount of debt, they estimate the amount of debt service that it will cost to pay for that. And they include that in the forecasted spending for the future. And I believe that's the only instance of forecasted spending that is not based on current law. It's based on the assumption that we will pass a bonding bill of a certain size. And currently, the November 2020 forecast assumes that the legislature will pass a $240 million general obligation bonding bill in an odd-numbered year, or in odd-numbered years, and $880 million in even-numbered years. And because that's the November forecast, it captures the bonding bill that was passed last October. Stephanie mentioned the debt capacity guidelines, and this slide just shows where the state is relative to those guideline limits. So the guideline number 1, which spells out that the total tax-supported debt that has been sold does not exceed 3.25% of state personal income, is we're currently at 2.27%. And just a little note, state personal income is a figure that's calculated in each forecast as well. It's put together by the economic firm that MMB uses to help with the forecast. Guideline number 2 is looks at the total amount of sold and unsold debt. So total authorized debt, including moral obligations and equipment and real estate leases, and says that should not exceed 6% of state personal income. Currently, it's at 3.93%. And the third guideline is just a measure of how quickly MMB retires this debt. And 40% of it has to be retired within 5 years, 70% within 10. Currently, they're projecting to retire more than that for both parts of that measure. The natural question that everybody has with those guidelines is, well, how much additional bonding can the state do? And MMB has started preparing this table with each of their debt capacity reports, which come out with the forecasts, to kind of answer that question. And these numbers highlighted in red here indicate the maximum bonding bill that could be enacted in each of those years before we would exceed any of the guidelines. And I believe it's always guideline number 1 that is in the most, we would hit guideline number 1 likely before we would ever exceed guideline number 2. So you can see that under the current guidelines, a bonding bill of just over $3.2 billion could be enacted before we would hit that 3.25% limit in fiscal year 24. And the reason that we would only hit it in fiscal 24 is that, as Stephanie said, bonds are not sold immediately upon a bonding bill's enactment. The bonds are let on a as-needed cash flow basis, and typically that doesn't peak for a couple fiscal years. The next slide just shows what's out there right now. So this is a very short time series looking back at the February 2018 forecast all the way through the November 2020 forecast. And this just shows the total outstanding tax-supported debt and other debt that's been issued as well. And this is both sold and unsold debt. So you can see in the past, over the past 2 years, that has climbed from about a little over 11.5 billion to $13.5 billion. Most of that is tax-supported debt, general obligation debt, and trunk highway debt. But this other obligation counts debt that goes against guideline number 2, which is moral obligations, equipment leases, that type of thing. This is just a table that breaks down the tax-supported debt portion of the previous chart and gives you an idea of the differential between general obligation bond debt and trunk highway fund bond debt. So you can see compared to, over the last 2 years, those proportions have remained roughly similar. When it comes to the debt service that the state has to pay every year, this is kind of a graphical depiction of how much it costs. It's the total debt service has been for the last quite a few years has been between 850 million and a little over $1 billion per year. Of that, the general obligation debt has hovered right around $600 million per year. And you'll notice that that has stayed largely the same, even though more debt has gone out the door. And the reason that debt service hasn't kept pace is that interest rates have been very low. We've been able to sell bonds for very cheap. And so I won't get into too much of what the economic forecast says about this, but that's expected to continue for at least a few more years. This is just the table version of the previous chart. So if you ever wanted to look at the specific number, you could use this table to do that. Just one other thing I wanted to mention that didn't really fit in these slides. Stephanie alluded to the governor's capital budget. There's no statutory requirement that the governor release or propose a capital budget in an odd numbered year like this one. But we know from the governor's operating budget that came out a few weeks ago that there will be some debt service included in that. And so eventually the governor will really propose a capital budget this year, and it will be about $490 million. $240 million of that will be general obligation debt, which is the forecast assumption. So, $250 million will be of appropriation bonds. 100 million of that will be housing infrastructure bonds, and another $150 million will be new appropriation bonds designed to respond to the civil unrest in Minneapolis and St. Paul this summer with some rebuilding. There's a lot of details about the governor's capital budget that will be unknown until it's released, but that's what we can infer based on the governor's operating budget that came out. That's all I had, and I can open it up for any questions.
So, and Casey, the date that his bonding recommendations come out next January, there's a date in statute, right? Is it like the 15th of January or?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. I believe it is the 15th of January. I will look at that, and if I'm wrong, I will let you know.
Any questions?
Mr. Chair?
Senator Sandrum.
Mr. Chair, just Casey, if you just go to the, the table I'm sorry. So let me just round number this. When we say we have our debt service costs are $1 billion for a biennium. That is to say that with respect to the past biennium at about $52 billion, one of those $1 billion went to debt services, right? Or cost for bond service, right?
Mr. Chair, Senator Sen John, yeah, that's a
Okay.
good way to characterize it.
So that's like a, generally speaking, 2% or so. So I'm kind of thinking out loud here. So just affirm that if that's the case.
Mr. Chair, Senator Sen John, yeah, you've
Okay.
I think you've got it.
So Senator Bach and members, 2% of what we budget for going for important state infrastructure, I don't think is too much. We spend a lot of other money on programmatic things. I'm an infrastructure fan. I don't think 2% is too much.
Senator Sen John, I'm a retired carpenter. I tell people, and when we're building stuff, my friends are working. So I will do everything I can do to get leadership to push the number as high as we can. And, but one of the frustrations in the Senate always is the bill has to originate in the House.
Right.
So that's always a challenge. And I guess I can't tell you when we'll have another committee hearing, because the next thing we really need, I think we should consider is last year's bonding bill, and this is not unusual. There were a couple, I think a half a dozen little technical errors in the drafting that MMB flagged that need to get fixed before the bonds can be issued for those projects. So I introduced and that's the bill, those of you that were in the special session in December, that's the bill that Senator Sen John that we took up in the special session and passed, that the House decided not to act on. So we're trying to work with the House. Senator Rosen's been very, very involved because one of her projects is one that's just sitting, waiting to start. Senator Gazelka, I know, has been talking to Speaker Hortman to see if we could get the House to clean this stuff up. We're at some risk that the House just decides to just wait and roll it into, a larger bill later in the session. So we're continuing to try. In fact, I thought there was going to be a Zoom meeting between the bonding chairs and the Speaker and the Majority Leader today, but at least it hasn't gotten on my calendar yet. But we had asked for that. So I'm assuming our next meeting is going to be to go through the provisions in that bill so that we all know what's in there. I don't know exactly what the House is going to send us. So, I mean, we might, if it looks like the House is going to send something over, we'll probably wait until we see what the House sends over so we can kind of go through everything that they've got on their list. It could be there's some other things that that should be done to make other projects go. So I don't know a lot more than that. I know it's very frustrating for the half a dozen members that have got projects in their districts that are ready and can't start. So any other questions?
Mr. Chair, could I just follow up on that a little bit?
Sure, Senator Sen John.
And I'd like to follow up with Ms. James, because on her third slide, it says a bill that authorizes GO bonds must originate in the House. I can understand that. A bill, however, that corrects language to GO bonds that have already been authorized, I wonder why that has to originate in the House. In my mind, the bonds have already been authorized. The language which encircles the purpose of those bonds may need slight technical fixes. Why does that have to originate in the House? And I'm sort of challenging our legal counsel, Ms. James, but I just like any clarification on that. Is that custom and tradition, or is it really in fact fact?
Mr. Chair and Senator Sen John, remember that before bonds are issued, they have to get a clearance opinion from bond counsel and also the Attorney General. And they have opined that any changes to an authorization of bond proceeds has to originate in the House. And many of these changes are not merely technical. For example, the actual project may have changed somewhat, or we might be funding a later phase of it than we had thought we were funding because the local government has moved on a little bit with it. So while we call them technical changes, they're not all merely technical, and some of them really do, the description as revised is a somewhat different project.
Mr. Chairman, and may I just follow up with just one follow-up question?
Go ahead.
One of them, for instance, is a typographical change. And so it sounds like, yes, okay, our bond counsel and our attorney general's office says that still needs to originate in the House, but so what we're talking about here is a kind of a local opinion, not a constitutional directive. Is that correct, Ms. James?
Mr. Chair and members, they are not merely an opinion, they are the gatekeeper to our sale of bonds. So they have a little more authority and effect on the issue than maybe in some other context, an opinion of a council. I think that there probably certainly are some changes that are small enough to a modification of a bond appropriation that maybe it wouldn't need to originate in the House, and maybe we could try passing it and find out how that works out if bond counsel will clear it, and if we then are able to release the money to the local government. But the bond market is just inherently the most conservative world. And so they're disinclined to try new things. So our bond counsel would likely take a conservative approach to an opinion about that. But there's nothing stopping the Senate from trying it.
Thank you, Ms. James. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Champion.
Mr. Chair, from my understanding, state appropriation bonds do not necessarily have to be originated in the House. And I know in the governor's proposed budget, we also heard the fiscal analysts talk about something that the governor has proposed, and something that's been proposed for quite some time, which is use of some appropriation bonds for rebuilding for those businesses affected by the civil unrest that had nothing to do with what was going on. So I asked the chair just to think about that, or to think about other ways by which to also be helpful when we think in terms of the need, and then also to help get the House on board with some of the things that we'd like to have done. So that's all I was saying. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and maybe a little bit to Senator Senjum's question and beyond. Once a project is funded by bonds, what kind of long-term restrictions are there? So for example, last session we passed a project to allow the county to build and own an outlet channel for a lake with no natural outlet. But at some point in time, they'd like to move that over to a lake improvement district. I know I passed a bill to look at putting solar panels on brownfield former landfills, and there were some questions around whether or not those projects were funded by GO bonds. What are the restrictions once a project's funded by GO?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, for one thing, the sale will be restricted. It will have to be for market value, and the first dollar that comes in has to be used to pay off the bond proceeds. There is an exception when the property is transferred to another public entity for the same purpose. So that kind of a transfer can maybe be made not at fair market value, but for $1. there's also going to be a requirement that the local government enters into a grant agreement, and the grant agreement will control the uses, the amount of private use that can take place on the property that's been improved with bond proceeds. Yeah, I mean, those are the major things, I think, that the use that takes place inside this improved property will be affected by the fact that it was improved with bond proceeds. And then the transfer has some restrictions. Not total barriers, just some restrictions.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I might ask a follow-up.
Sure.
With that transfer from one public entity to another, does that have mandatory, or is that something that can be affected by the two public entities?
Mr. Chair, Senator Pratt, that is something that we'll put into law. We'll recognize that effect. We had a few of these a few years ago with some charter schools, and we had to craft language that the legislature passed to reflect that transfer.
Thank you.
Well, anybody, anything else? I don't see any hands up, so. Well, thank you, everybody. I just get a note that that meeting with the speaker and I and the majority leader is going to happen later today. So we might have some news for you. If we learn something about if the House is going to move, we'll try and let you know. But we're doing what we can to move that unfinished business along. Anything else? If not, we are adjourned to the call of the chair. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.